The acrid smell of cordite and death hung heavy over the French countryside, as Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Daly crouched behind a shattered oak tree, his weathered hands gripping his Springfield rifle with the familiarity of a man who had seen war on 3 continents. It was June 1st, 1918, and the German spring offensive had torn through Allied lines like a scythe through wheat, leaving nothing but carnage and retreat in its wake. The enemy now stood just 50 miles from Paris, and the fate of France, perhaps all of Europe, balanced on a knife's edge. Retreat, hell, we just got here. The words that would echo through Marine Corps' legend had not yet been spoken, but they lived in the hearts of every devil dog who stepped off the transport trucks near Chateau-Thierry that morning. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were United States Marines, the 4th Brigade under Brigadier General James Harbord, men who had earned their stripes in the steaming jungles of Nicaragua and the burning sands of Veracruz. Private First Class Carl Brannan adjusted his pack and squinted through the morning mist. At the dark tree line ahead, Belleau would stretch before them like a malevolent giant, its ancient oaks and tangled undergrowth hiding an enemy that had already proven they could break the back of empires. The Germans had transformed this once peaceful hunting preserve into a fortress of machine gun nests, barbed wire, and death. According to historical accounts documented in the Marine Corps Gazette, the situation was desperate beyond measure. French forces were in full retreat, their morale shattered after 4 years of unprecedented slaughter. British units had been decimated in the spring offensive, and fresh American doughboys were still learning the harsh realities of modern warfare. Only the Marines stood ready, their officers studying maps that showed German positions stretching deep into the wood, like the tentacles of some monstrous creature. Captain Lloyd Williams of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, gathered his company around him as artillery shells whistled overhead. His men were young. Many had never seen combat, but they carried themselves with the swagger that came from knowing they were Marines. They had trained harder, marched farther, and shot straighter than any other fighting force in the American Expeditionary Force. Listen up, devil dogs, Williams called out, his voice cutting through the distant rumble of guns. The French are falling back, but we're not French, we're Marines, and Marines don't retreat. His eyes swept over faces that ranged from barely 18 to grizzled veterans of the Banana Wars. That wood up there is full of Germans who think they're going to march into Paris. We're going to show them they're wrong. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the shell-torn fields that separated the Marines from their destiny. In the distance, the spires of French villages stood silhouetted against a sky that promised either glory or death. The Marines checked their weapons one final time, adjusted their gear, and prepared to write their names in history with blood and courage. As the first German machine guns opened fire from the depths of Belleau Wood, the die was cast. This would not be just another battle in a war that had already consumed millions. This would be the crucible that forged an unbreakable brotherhood and proved that some things honor, courage, and the cause were worth dying for. The earth erupted in fountains of dirt and shrapnel as German artillery found its range, turning the peaceful French countryside into a hellscape of smoke and screaming steel. Captain Williams felt the concussion of nearby explosions ripple through his chest as he studied the tree line through his field glasses. The Marines of his company were spread in a skirmish line across the wheat field, their khaki uniforms standing out against the golden grain like targets on a firing range. Fix bayonets. The command echoed down the line, and 2,000 Marines drew their 17-inch steel blades with a sound like whispered death. These were the same bayonets that had tasted blood in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, carried by men who understood that sometimes the only way forward was through the heart of the enemy. 2nd Lieutenant Clifton Cates, barely 24 years old but already a veteran of Veracruz, rose from his position and looked back at his platoon. Dirt caked his uniform, and a thin line of blood trickled from a shell fragment that had grazed his cheek. But his eyes burned with the fire that separated Marines from mere mortals. Come on, you devil dogs, do you want to live forever? The charge began not with bugles or grand speeches, but with the simple act of Marines doing what Marines do, moving forward when others retreat, attacking when others defend, dying when others surrender. They advanced across that field under a hail of machine gun fire that turned the air itself into a weapon. Their battle cry lost in the thunder of guns, but written in their hearts, Semper Fidelis. Private Brannan felt a bullet tug at his sleeve as he ran, his breath coming in short gasps, his rifle held at port arms. Around him, Marines were falling, good men, brothers, friends, but the line pressed forward. This was the moment that separated the wheat from the chaff, when training and discipline meant the difference between victory and annihilation. As documented in official war records from the National Archives, the German defenders had positioned themselves with scientific precision. Maxim machine guns created interlocking fields of fire that could cut down entire companies in minutes. Snipers in camouflaged positions picked off officers and non-commissioned officers with methodical efficiency. The ancient oaks of Belleau would provided perfect concealment for an enemy that had learned to kill with industrial efficiency. Gunnery Sergeant Daly found himself in a shell crater with half a dozen Marines. German bullets whining overhead like angry hornets. Blood from a scalp wound ran down his face, but his grip on his rifle never wavered. At 54, he was older than most of these boys' fathers, but age had only sharpened his understanding of war's cruel mathematics. "We can't stay here, Gunny," shouted Corporal James Robertson over the din of battle. "They've got us zeroed in." Daly wiped the blood from his eyes and studied the German positions. Machine gun nests were dug in among the roots of massive oaks, their crews protected by logs and sandbags. Barbed wire stretched between the trees like a spider's web designed by madmen. It was a killing ground that had already claimed hundreds of French and British lives. "Then we go forward," Daly replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had fought in 3 wars and lived to tell about it. "Marines don't retreat." He looked at each man in turn, seeing his own determination reflected in their faces. "When I give the word, we're going over the top. Stay low, move fast, and remember the only easy day was yesterday." The Marines burst from their cover like men possessed, rushing toward the German lines with a fury that shocked even seasoned enemy veterans. This was not the methodical advance of European armies, worn down by years of trench warfare. This was something primal and terrible, the charge of men who had been told they were invincible and believed it with every fiber of their being. The ancient oaks of Belleau Wood had witnessed centuries of French history, but nothing had prepared them for the carnage that now unfolded beneath their branches. Machine gun bullets carved chunks from bark that had weathered the reign of kings, while the screams of wounded Marines mingled with the harsh chatter of German Maxims. In a symphony of death that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives, Private Brannan pressed himself against the moss-covered trunk of a massive oak, his heart hammering against his ribs as bullets whined past his head. 20 yards ahead, a German machine gun nest commanded the narrow game trail that wound deeper into the wood. The crew had concealed their position with masterful skill, using fallen logs and carefully placed brush to create a fortress that seemed to blend with the forest itself. "We need to flank that gun," whispered Corporal Robertson, crawling up beside Brannan. His uniform was torn and bloody, and his left arm hung useless at his side, but his eyes still burned with the determination that had carried him through the wheat field. "If we can work around to the right," his words were cut short by the distinctive crack of a German sniper's rifle. A Marine behind them pitched forward without a sound, blood spreading across his khaki blouse like spilled wine. The enemy had turned this peaceful hunting preserve into a maze of death, where every shadow might conceal a rifle barrel and every fallen log could hide a machine gun. Gunnery Sergeant Daly had worked his way to within 50 yards of the German line, using terrain that he read like a familiar book. Behind him, scattered through the undergrowth, the remnants of his company waited for orders. Good Marines, most of them, though many would never see home again. War had a way of separating the wheat from the chaff with brutal efficiency. The machine gun nest that had been dealing death all morning suddenly fell silent. For a moment, the forest held its breath, the only sound the moaning of wounded men and the distant rumble of artillery. Then a figure emerged from the German position, a Marine, his bayonet red with blood, his face set in the grim mask of a man who had looked death in the eye and refused to blink. as recorded in official Marine Corps' historical documents. It was Private First Class Henry Larson who had single-handedly assaulted the position, crawling through a drainage ditch that offered concealment from the machine gunners. His attack had been swift and silent, settling accounts with cold steel and the tradition of Marines who understood that sometimes the only way to win was to get close enough to see the whites of the enemy's eyes. "Move up," Daly's command carried through the wood, and Marines began advancing from tree to tree, using every bit of cover the forest provided. They had learned the hard way that this was not open field fighting where courage alone could carry the day. This was intimate warfare, where survival depended on cunning as much as bravery. Captain Williams found himself separated from his company, moving through a nightmare landscape where German snipers had turned every clearing into a killing ground. His uniform was shredded by thorns and shell fragments, his face streaked with dirt and smoke. But his resolve never wavered. These were his Marines scattered through the wood, and he would die before abandoning them to face the enemy alone. A burst of machine gun fire erupted from his left, followed by the distinctive sound of Marines calling for corpsmen. Williams low-crawled toward the sound, his rifle cradled in his arms, every sense alert for the telltale signs of German positions. The enemy had prepared their defenses with Teutonic thoroughness, creating a web of mutually supporting positions that could survive anything except the kind of individual courage that Marines carried in their DNA. Through a gap in the undergrowth, he saw them 3 Marines pinned down by a machine gun crew that had positioned itself behind the fallen trunk of an ancient oak. The Germans were good soldiers, professionals who understood their business, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had challenged United States Marines on ground that would be paid for in blood, and Marines never forgot a debt. Williams worked his way around the position, moving with the patience of a hunter who understood that haste meant death. The German machine gunner was focused on the Marines to his front, not expecting an attack from the flank. It was a fatal error, one that would cost him everything in the next few seconds. The forest erupted in violence as Williams opened fire, his Springfield barking with mechanical precision. The German crew never had a chance to swing their weapon around before Marine steel found them, settling accounts that had been written in the blood of good men who deserved better than graves in foreign soil. The German officer crouched in his command bunker could scarcely believe the reports flooding in from his forward positions. These Marines fought with a savagery that defied every principle of modern warfare he had learned in the military academies of Prussia. They did not retreat when faced with superior firepower. They did not break when their officers fell. Instead, they seemed to grow more dangerous with each casualty, pressing forward with a determination that bordered on madness. "Teufel Hunden," he muttered, using the German phrase that would become legendary. Devil dogs. It was a name born of respect tinged with fear, recognition that these leather-necked Marines represented something new and terrible on the battlefields of Europe. Deeper in the wood, Gunnery Sergeant Daly had gathered the scattered remnants of his squad around a massive boulder that provided concealment from German snipers. His men were exhausted, their uniforms torn and bloody, but their eyes still held the fire that separated Marines from ordinary soldiers. These were the men who had charged across that wheat field under murderous fire, who had pressed into the wood when wiser men would have sought cover. "How many rounds you got left?" Robertson, Daly asked, checking his own ammunition supply with the practiced efficiency of a man who had made such calculations in the Philippines, Nicaragua, and a dozen other forgotten conflicts. 40 rounds, Gunny," came the reply. "Maybe 50 if I'm careful." It wasn't enough. They all knew it. The Germans had turned Belleau Wood into a fortress with overlapping fields of fire, prepared positions, and supply lines that stretched back to their main force. The Marines had courage and determination, but bullets and bayonets could only carry them so far against such odds. According to battlefield reports, documented in the Army War Records, the situation was growing desperate by the hour. Marine casualties were mounting at an unsustainable rate, and German reinforcements were moving up from reserve positions. The enemy had every advantage except one: they were not United States Marines. Private Brannan found himself alone in a Small clearing where shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy like cathedral light. The silence was deceptive. He could hear German voices calling to each other somewhere ahead, coordinating their defenses with the methodical efficiency that had made them masters of Europe. But there was something else in that silence, something that made his blood sing with anticipation. The sound came from behind him, the distinctive rhythm of Marine boots moving through underbrush. With predatory grace, he turned to see Captain Williams emerging from the shadows, his uniform torn, but his bearing erect, followed by a dozen Marines who looked like they had walked through hell and decided they liked the climate. "Form on me," Williams commanded, in a voice that carried absolute authority. "We're going to show these Germans what happens when they mess with Marines." The attack that followed would be studied in military academies for generations to come, not for its tactical brilliance, but for the sheer audacity of men who refused to acknowledge the possibility of defeat. Williams led his Marines through the German positions like an avenging angel, using terrain and surprise to overcome superior numbers and firepower. They moved through the wood like ghosts, striking from unexpected angles, disappearing into the shadows before the enemy could respond. This was not the methodical advance of European armies, but something primal and deadly warfare reduced to its essential elements of courage, skill, and an unbreakable will to victory. Corporal Edward Kelly found himself face to face with a German machine gun crew that had been decimating Marine positions all morning. There was no time for careful planning or tactical considerations. There was only the moment when training and instinct merged into action that would determine who lived and who died in this green hell. His attack was swift and decisive, crossing the 20 yards between cover and enemy position in a sprint that carried him through machine gun fire that should have cut him in half. His bayonet found its mark with the precision of countless hours of training, settling accounts that had been written in the blood of his brothers. As the sun began to set on June 6, 1918, the Marines held a precarious foothold. In Belleau Wood, they had paid a terrible price for every yard of ground, but they had proven something that would echo through the ages. They had shown the world that Marines were different, that they carried something inside them that could not be broken by bullets or bayonets, or the accumulated weight of 4 years of industrial slaughter. The wood was theirs, but holding it would require sacrifices that would test the very soul of the corps. The pre-dawn darkness of June 10, 1918, settled over Belleau Wood like a funeral shroud, broken only by the intermittent flash of artillery fire and the ghostly silhouettes of Marines moving through positions they had carved from German flesh and steel. The cost had been staggering: companies reduced to squads, platoons commanded by corporals, entire units existing only in the memories of survivors who whispered names of the dead. During quiet moments between battles, Gunnery Sergeant Daly knelt beside a wounded Marine, pressing a field dressing against a chest wound that bubbled with each labored breath. Private Tommy O'Brien was 19 years old, a farm boy from Iowa who had lied about his age to join the corps, and now he lay dying under foreign stars in a wood whose name he could barely pronounce. "Tell my ma I did good, Gunny," O'Brien whispered, his young face pale in the moonlight. "Tell her I didn't shame the uniform." "You did fine, son," Daly replied, his voice rough with emotion he could not afford to show. "You did real fine." He stayed with the boy until the end, watching life fade from eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. It was a scene repeated countless times throughout the wood. Marines dying far from home, but surrounded by brothers who would carry their memory forward. Captain Williams had established his command post in what remained of a German bunker, its log walls scarred by bullets and shrapnel. His maps were spread across a makeshift table constructed from ammunition boxes, marked with positions that changed with each report from his scattered platoons. The Marines held perhaps half the wood, but German counterattacks came with the regularity of clockwork, testing their lines with an intensity that would have broken lesser men. "Sir, we've got movement on the left flank," reported Corporal Robertson, his arm still in a makeshift sling, but his rifle ready for action. "Looks like company strength, maybe more." Williams studied his map by the flickering light of a candle stub. His force was down to fewer than 400 effective Marines, facing an enemy that seemed to have unlimited reserves. Logic dictated withdrawal, consolidation, a tactical retreat that would preserve his remaining men for future battles. But Marines did not retreat, and Belleau would have become more than a tactical objective. It had become a symbol of everything. The Corps represented as documented in the personal journals of war correspondents embedded with Marine units. The fighting in Belleau Wood had taken on an almost mythical quality. Stories spread through the American Expeditionary Force of Marines, who charged machine gun nests with empty rifles, using nothing but bayonets and determination. French civilians spoke in hushed tones of Les Diables Marins, who had stopped the German advance when all seemed lost. The counterattack came at dawn, preceded by an artillery barrage that turned ancient oaks into matchsticks and filled the air with splinters sharp as knives. German infantry advanced through the smoke with the mechanical precision of men who had learned their trade in 4 years of European warfare. But they had never faced Marines who understood that retreat was not in their vocabulary. Private Brannan found himself in a fighting hole that had once been a German machine gun nest, surrounded by the detritus of modern warfare, empty cartridge cases, blood-stained bandages, and the personal effects of soldiers who would never need them again. His rifle was fouled with dirt and powder residue, his uniform torn and stained with blood that might have been his own or that of the Marine who had shared the position. Until a sniper's bullet found its mark, the German attack rolled toward him like a gray-green tide, soldiers advancing with the methodical efficiency of a machine designed for killing. But machines could be broken, and Marines had learned to break them with precisely applied violence that shocked even veteran enemies who thought they had seen everything war could offer. Brannan's rifle spoke with the voice of American industry, each round carefully placed to maximum effect. Round him, Marines fought with the desperation of men who knew they were making history with their blood. This was not just another battle in a war that had already consumed millions. This was the moment when the Marine Corps would prove its worth on European battlefields or die in the attempt. The tide of German infantry broke on Marine positions like waves against granite cliffs. Men who had conquered most of Europe found themselves facing Americans who fought with a fury that defied explanation. These Marines did not fight for territory or political objectives. They fought for each other, for the Corps, and for the honor of men who had promised to be faithful unto death. When the sun set on that bloody day, the wood still belonged to Marines who had paid for it with everything they had to give. But the price had been almost beyond comprehension, and the survivors understood that they were no longer the same men who had stepped off those transport trucks what seemed like a lifetime ago. They were Marines, forged in fire and tempered in blood, bound together by experiences that would define brotherhood for generations to come. The morning of June 26, 1918, dawned with the peculiar clarity that often preceded decisive battles, as if nature itself understood that history would be written before the sun set again. Gunnery Sergeant Daly crouched in what had once been a German command bunker, studying intelligence reports that painted a grim picture of enemy strength. The Germans had spent 3 weeks preparing their final defensive positions, turning the remaining portions of Belleau Wood into a fortress that bristled with machine guns, artillery, and the accumulated hatred of men who refused to acknowledge defeat. "They're not going to give it up easy, Gunny," observed Corporal Robertson, now carrying sergeant's stripes earned in blood rather than on parade grounds. His left arm still bore the stiffness of improperly healed wounds, but his rifle hand remained steady. "Intelligence says they've got at least 2 battalions dug in around that ridge line, with artillery support from their main line." Daly nodded grimly, his weathered face bearing new lines carved by 3 weeks of combat that had tested every principle he had learned in 26 years of Marine service. These Germans were not the colonial rebels or Banana Republic soldiers he had faced in previous campaigns. They were professionals who understood their business, led by officers who had learned warfare in the most expensive school on earth, the trenches of the Western Front. Captain Williams gathered his company commanders round a map that bore the stains of sweat and blood, marked with positions that had been paid for with Marine lives. His force had been reinforced with fresh troops from the States, young Marines who carried themselves with the swagger of men who had heard the stories, but not yet learned the cost of courage. They would learn soon enough. "Gentlemen, we've taken most of this wood, but we're not finished," Williams began, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had led Marines through hell and brought them out the other side. "Intelligence indicates the Germans have concentrated their remaining forces around Hill 242. They're calling it their final defensive line. And they're probably right. According to official Marine Corps historical records maintained at Quantico, the final assault on Belleau would involve coordination between Marine rifle companies, artillery support from French 75s, and close air support from newly arrived American aircraft. It represented the evolution of modern warfare, where victory depended on the seamless integration of multiple weapon systems, commanded by men who understood that failure meant more than tactical defeat. It meant dishonoring the memory of Marines who had already paid the ultimate price. Private Brannan had been promoted to corporal, his new stripes a testament to survival as much as leadership ability. He led a squad of Marines who ranged from battle-hardened veterans to replacements so fresh they still carried the smell of stateside training camps. The blend was volatile, but effective, experienced hands teaching hard-won lessons to young men who would either learn quickly or die trying. "Stay close to me," he instructed Private Matthews, a red-headed kid from Boston who could not have been more than 17, despite his claims of being 21. "Watch what the experienced men do, and don't be a hero. Dead heroes don't help anybody." The artillery preparation began at 0600 hours. French 75s walking their shells across German positions with methodical precision. The bombardment was heavier than anything the Marines had seen in their previous assaults, designed to pulverize defensive positions that had withstood 3 weeks of determined attacks. But Marines had learned not to trust artillery alone. Germans had an uncomfortable habit of surviving bombardments that should have reduced them to constituent atoms. As the barrage lifted, Marine companies moved forward with the coordinated precision of a machine designed for one purpose: the application of disciplined violence against enemies of the United States. They advanced through undergrowth that had been shredded by shellfire, past the wreckage of previous battles, toward positions that represented the final German stronghold in a wood that had become synonymous with Marine courage. The first German machine gun opened fire when the lead elements were 50 yards from the base of Hill 242, its distinctive chatter announcing that the enemy had indeed survived the bombardment and retained the will to fight. More guns joined the chorus, creating a web of interlocking fire that should have stopped the Marine advance before it truly began. But Marines had spent 3 weeks learning to break such defenses, developing tactics that combined individual initiative with coordinated firepower. They moved forward in bounds, one element providing covering fire while another advanced, leapfrogging toward objectives that would be taken regardless of cost. Gunnery Sergeant Daly found himself leading the final charge up Hill 242, his Springfield rifle speaking with mechanical precision as he closed with an enemy that had learned to respect Marine marksmanship. Around him, Marines fought with the accumulated fury of men who had buried too many friends in foreign soil, who understood that this hill represented more than tactical advantage. It represented vindication for every Marine who had died believing that Semper Fidelis meant something more than words on a recruiting poster. The silence that settled over Belleau Wood on the afternoon of June 26, 1918, was unlike anything the survivors had experienced in their 3 weeks of hell. It was not the temporary quiet between artillery barrages, or the brief respite while enemy machine gunners changed ammunition belts. This was the silence of victory, purchased with Marine blood and paid for with courage that would be remembered as long as the Corps existed. Gunnery Sergeant Daly stood atop Hill 242, surveying a battlefield that bore testament to the price of taking ground from determined enemies. German bodies lay scattered among the defensive positions they had died defending, testimony to soldiers who had fought with professional competence, but lacked the indefinable quality that separated Marines from ordinary mortals. They had been good soldiers, but they had faced Marines who understood that some things were worth dying for. Belleau Wood is now U.S. Marine Corps entirely. Captain Williams dictated to his field message operator the words that would echo through Marine Corps history, spoken without fanfare or dramatic flourish. They were simply a statement of fact, delivered by a man who had led Marines through a crucible that would define the Corps for generations to come. Private, now Corporal Brannan, knelt beside the body of Private Matthews, the red-headed kid from Boston who had taken a sniper's bullet during the final assault. The boy's eyes stared sightlessly at a sky he would never see again, his rifle still clutched in hands that would never pull another trigger. He had lived long enough to learn what it meant to be a Marine, long enough to prove that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function despite it. The casualty reports would make grim reading for headquarters staff, who calculated victories in terms of territory gained versus losses sustained. The Marines had suffered over 50% casualties in their 3 weeks of fighting, losses that would have broken the morale of conventional units. But Marines were not conventional soldiers, and Belleau had proven that some objectives could only be taken by men who refused to accept the possibility of failure. As documented in official French military records preserved in the Archives Nationales, the Battle of Belleau represented a turning point in Allied fortunes on the Western Front. German forces that had seemed invincible during their spring offensive had been stopped and thrown back by Marines who fought with an intensity that shocked European observers accustomed to the methodical warfare of trench fighting. The French would rename the wood Bois de la Brigade des Marines in honor of the men who had died among its ancient oaks. But the Marines who survived knew it would always be Belleau, the place where the Corps had proven its worth on European battlefields and earned the right to stand beside any fighting force in the world. Gunnery Sergeant Daly gathered the survivors around him as the sun began to set, casting long shadows through trees that bore the scars of modern warfare. These Marines looked older than their years, aged by experiences that had compressed a lifetime of learning into 3 weeks of combat. They were no longer the cocky youngsters who had stepped off transport trucks with dreams of glory and adventure. They were Marines, forged in fire and tempered in blood. "We've lost good men," Daly began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through a quarter-century of Marine service. Marines who deserved better than graves in foreign soil. But they died as Marines die, facing the enemy, fighting for their brothers, faithful to the Corps and everything it represents. He paused, looking at faces that reflected the cost of victory, measured in more than tactical objectives achieved. These men would carry Belleau with them for the rest of their lives, would wake from dreams that echoed with machine gun fire and the cries of wounded Marines, calling for corpsmen who could not save them all. "We came here to fight Germans," Daly continued, "but we found something more important. We found out what it really means to be Marines. Not the recruiting poster version or the parade ground show, the real thing. Marines who stand when others fall, who advance when others retreat, who die when others surrender. The brotherhood forged in Belleau would outlast the war, outlast the men who fought there, outlast the nations that sent them to fight. It would become part of Marine Corps' DNA, passed down through generations of Marines who would face their own crucibles in places with names like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Chosin, and Fallujah. As night fell over the wood, Marines began the grim task of burying their dead and caring for their wounded. They worked in silence, understanding that words were inadequate for expressing what they had shared. They were Marines, bound together by experiences that transcended ordinary human understanding, faithful to each other and to the Corps that had given their lives meaning. Belleau was quiet at last, but its echoes would resonate through Marine Corps history forever, a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, some ground is worth dying for, and Semper Fidelis is more than a motto. It is a promise sealed in blood and honored by every Marine who has ever worn the eagle, globe, and anchor. The legend of Belleau would live forever. But the men who created it were already looking ahead to the next battle, the next test of Marine courage and determination. They were Marines, and Marines never rest while there are battles to be fought and brothers to be protected. Semper Fidelis, always faithful, forever.